Hello and welcome to the Someday Arrival podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to change the world. When you see an injustice on a global scale, when you see a need, when you see a cause that needs fighting for, how do you make that change? How do you get other people mobilized behind that change? We're going to talk about that today on the Someday Arrival podcast. So hello, we're trying a slightly different format today. I am trying to start with a different format today, and that is in televisual glory. So here we go. We've got the new mic. We've got the phone. I'm going to try and be a little less heavy with the editing. And hopefully you're still going to enjoy this. And once we've got this kind of set, I think next season we're going to start a new series and perhaps have some interviews and begin to meet some leaders and some people who made their someday dream a reality. So I hope that you'll stick around for that. But today, at the moment, COP26 is happening. You can't really miss it. It is a gathering of world leaders, of lobbyists, of climate activists, of companies, of charities, all sorts of people, the good and the great, coming together to try and keep the dream of 1.5 degrees alive, keep 1.5 alive in terms of temperature above industrial levels, I believe is the right term. And you've got countries there who are going to be incredibly affected if sea levels rise. You've got companies there who will be affected if governments begin to put sanctions on certain fossil fuels. And so it is really an interesting time. But how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point where the world is working together, seemingly, to try and achieve something incredible and important? And it is a really important time, isn't it? Right now, I believe the world, this planet, and people on this planet are facing a trio of threats. They are facing some devastating threats that could undo decades of progress. I'm talking about with 3 C's to keep it simple: conflict, climate, currency, maybe another C in there, COVID. So you have got conflict in this world. You've got fragile states, fragile nations. You've got extremism still rearing its head, causing displacement of people internally in nations and across borders. Effectively, we're still seeing the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. So conflict is playing a huge part in threatening the progress for the poor, progress for those who are trying to make it in the world. Climate, obviously rising sea levels, global warming. We are seeing wildfires on a scale we've never seen before. We are seeing countries hitting all-time highs in terms of temperature. And there's talk of, and I've seen various visuals of this, certain countries becoming almost uninhabitable. Some countries which will effectively be underwater soon, island nations especially, and poorer nations. And we know that climate change always disproportionately affects the poorest people in the world. They're the people who have least impact on the climate. They're contributing the least to those changes, those concerning changes. Actually, it's the richer countries and the bigger industrialized countries and the global north countries that are making the biggest impact. But it's the poorer, low-income and middle-income nations that are really bearing the brunt of it. And then the third C is currency. Taxation injustice, a situation where riches and money stay with people who know how to occasionally evade, but usually avoid paying those taxes, where companies are almost more powerful and have a bigger profit margin than the gross domestic product of some small nations. And you've got multinational companies really with such clout and such power that they are managing to resist taxation. And there's a lot of debate at the moment about how much billionaires are paying. You've got a lot of billionaire spacemen at the moment using their money to go to space and have this incredible experience. But what does that mean for the world when all of the money is going not just to the 1%, but the 0.01%? I've got nothing against capitalism. I've got nothing against people making money and being successful. I do have something against systematic situations where the poor are kept poor by those who are rich and those who are in power. And when so much injustice is caused by corrupt or just unfair power and people in power, then that needs to be looked at. And even situations like the debasing of the currency, inflation, which is caused often by printing more money to keep the capitalist machine going. You've got a situation there where, let's say, the banks, arguably, in the global financial crisis, were reckless of money, and then the effect is you have to print more money in order to keep the economy going. The banks get bailed out, and it's the poor who find they are paying more for their food, paying more for their housing, etc. So anyway, conflict, climate, currency, all play their part in causing poverty and misery for those who are most disaffected, most marginalised, those who are poorest and living on the least amount every day. And then you add COVID into the mix, and effectively, where we'd made 20 years of progress, for the first time, we've had 20 years of progress with more people being pulled out of poverty, and then COVID hits, and we're in danger of losing 2 decades worth of progress. And you can't ignore the fact that half the world's been vaccinated, but it's not the richest half. The poorest half of the world still hasn't been vaccinated, which is, I was talking to someone today, sort of counterproductive, really, isn't it? I'm here in the UK, and we're on to our 3rd dose of a vaccine now, but it's being offered to children. It's been re-offered to adults who don't have comorbidities, they don't have underlying health issues. So you've got, we're on our 3rd, maybe 4th vaccine offering in this country, and yet you've got people, even doctors, even nurses in some sub-Saharan African nations who haven't even had their 1st vaccine yet, let alone their 2nd or 3rd. They've not even had a full dose. Sometimes haven't had the 1st of 2 jabs to complete 1 vaccination. So an incredibly unjust rolling out, and you've got the World Health Organization saying, please stop vaccinating people when they don't need it. Stop vaccinating children before we've vaccinated all the adults, for example. I'm really passionate about this. Ultimately, this virus isn't going to go away, and it's going to keep mutating until globally we can get a handle on it, and globally we can vaccinate against it. And even if it's endemic, even if it's with us forever, at least if everyone's vaccinated, it will slow the rate. I'm not an expert in these things, but it will slow the rate of mutation and of variants. And we've seen that when the virus is allowed to run rampant, what it does is it does mutate, and it become more can't remember what the term is now, but more transmissible, I believe. It becomes more virulent, potentially, maybe even affecting children one day in a worse way, and it becomes easier to pass from person to person. So we can't be in a situation where we only vaccinate the rich people and the rich nations. So again, conflict, climate, currency, COVID, all endanger people. They can be devastating, and they can cause poverty and misery. So in the face of those 4 C's, let's give you another 4 C's, which for me, as far as I can see, are the way you change the world. And I've thought, just reflecting on COP26 and some of the key players and key faces and names, both kind of famous leaders, people like Barack Obama, and but also people like Greta Thunberg. What is it about these people, and what is it about this movement? How, specifically about climate change, how has that become and accepted, for the most part, a cause that pretty much everyone, more or less, I would say the majority of people you talk to, agree that, one, the planet is warming, that the ice caps are melting, but the pollution needs to be capped and needs to be controlled. Most people today realise that we need to do more to save species from going extinct. not least ourselves. But how's that happen? Because that didn't happen overnight, and obviously continuing to this day, there's fake news around it, and there's controversy, and there is resistance to that, depending on kind of where you get your money and your power from. So here are 4 C's that I think you can see at play, and I'll tell you in just in general terms about these 4 C's, and then we can look perhaps at some examples throughout history, and then maybe you can comment at where you find this, and you can tell me whether or not you agree. The first C is, maybe controversially, civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. You have to disrupt life for those who are unaffected by the problem until you get noticed by the media, maybe locally, then nationally, then internationally, and until you begin to get noticed by those in power. And that probably means in government, but it can mean power in terms of celebrity power, it can be power in terms of corporate power. You upset the status quo, and I believe, with my faith, you do it non-violently. Now, there are examples of people doing it violently, and that again can lose you some support and some sympathy, but it also can gain you some support from some camps if people feel that's your last resort. But in general, civil disobedience of some kind, and I would say usually non-violent, in order to garner more support, which we'll talk about in a moment, is where you start. Now, again, I'll come to examples, but whether it's Rosa Parks disobeying segregation laws and keeping her seat on the bus, you've seen it all throughout history with people saying, thus far and no further, these rules, these laws, this prejudice, this discrimination has got to stop. And with COP, for example, you saw Greta, I think it's Thunberg, I believe the very first time was she sat outside Parliament, she skipped school, and she was just there on her own saying this isn't good enough, and it was an inspirational, symbolic moment. So civil disobedience is the first C. The second one is campaigning, and I would say campaigning creatively, finding creative ways to make your point, to voice your argument, to make your concerns heard and understood, often through symbolic or artistic peaceful protests. So I think about the Beatles and the anti-war movement, and you think about artists any time in history where there's been huge controversy or concern. Artists have come to the fore, haven't they? There have been songs, there have been pieces of art, there have been perhaps kind of contemporary art. There's always been things you can point at and look at, people who've creatively expressed their anger or frustration or sadness or fears using the creative arts. But so campaigning in of itself is great, but if you can do it in a way that gets attention, because lots of people are campaigning about lots of things all the time, more than ever. But if you can do it in a way that people think is clever and creative and stands out and makes a point and humanizes it, somehow puts flesh in it, somehow makes it more visual. I'm thinking about, for example, just recently we saw statues being pulled down. Then whether or not you think statues of, for example, people involved in the transatlantic slave trade should be pulled down, that's sort of irrelevant. The fact is, it's an incredibly symbolic thing to do, to pull down a long-standing statue in the middle of a city centre. That I don't know if you quite call it creative, but it's certainly stark and striking. That's just that image. Thirdly, so civil disobedience, disrupt life for people, make them get their attention, and find a way to get noticed. Secondly, once you've got noticed, start campaigning or keep campaigning, and be creative, be artistic, be symbolic. Find visual aids, find a way to visualize, to almost create a picture of the problem, not just conceptual. Thirdly, consensus building. And this is why I think violent protests and violent civil disobedience isn't necessarily helpful, because by the time you get to consensus building, you need to get a tipping point. You need to get people behind you. Usually that comes from the academic community. So with climate change, for example, one of the things that it took was for academic papers and research and peer-reviewed studies to build to a critical mass where people could no longer ignore it, no longer explain it away or call it a minority view or a sensationalist or whatever it is. They were able to build a body of evidence to say this is happening, and it was the research community that added their voice to campaigners, to those who are marching, those who are protesting, and it's the academic community who often political powers and leaders will need to look to. So they will see or hear a movement and a campaign. Perhaps it's got their attention or annoyed them that there's civil disobedience happening, and they're beginning to understand some of the campaign and what they're trying to fight and argue for and ask for. But then it's the academic community and it's other forms of consensus building where you begin to get a groundswell of the wider population. There will always be a minority, or there will always be niche communities who care about particular topics. That's nothing new. But what you do need is, especially for political powers to sit up and notice, is you need other people coming in and saying, yes, these guys aren't crazy. They know what they're talking about, and here is some evidence to show what they're saying is true and concerning. And it's only when you have civil disobedience added to by creative campaigning, added to by the consensus building that begins to win over the populace, which really, if you're certainly if you're in an elected democratic nation, you care about what the majority think, because the majority decide whether or not you're staying in place. Once you've got those three in place, then it begins to be enshrined in law, protected in law, laws can be changed, and it's also, interestingly, as I said earlier, adopted by multinational companies. It's adopted by multinational companies. But still, even then, with civil disobedience, with campaigning, with consensus building, and even with governments going, yeah, okay, well, you want us to do this, and you're voting for us, so we're going to do it. Even then, you don't see a change overnight most of the time. You have to keep reinforcing and rehearsing the arguments, rehearsing the need, until it becomes culturally accepted, a cultural norm. And I've defined it as this: until it becomes a mutually shared majority moral value. Bit of a mouthful. A mutually shared majority moral value. So it's all well and good that lots of people agree with you. Yeah, those guys are doing something really great over there. I'm for them. I'm not going to get up from my TV or my YouTube, but I'm generally good for you. Thank you for doing that. But then when it becomes cultural, oh gosh, I need to think about how often I'm eating meat, because that's going to affect the planet. I need to think about whether I get an electric car, because if I can afford a car, because that's going to affect the planet. Or maybe I'm going to cycle more. I'm going to start thinking about where I put my money, because my pound or my dollar is my vote in terms of companies and the way they're conducting themselves. And it becomes cultural. It becomes a moral issue, not just an interesting academic mental assent situation, and not just an interesting marginal campaign that you think, oh, that's got my attention. It becomes something that is shared, that is not just enshrined in law, that is not just something that companies are getting behind, but something that, as a global population or as a national population at the very least, people realise this is morally, ethically something we need to do. So there you go: civil disobedience, campaigning, consensus building, and even then, sometimes years, sometimes decades, it has to become a cultural norm in order to stick. And where have I seen that happen? Well, here's just a few examples. I'm sure you know more. These are the really obvious ones for me, but you could maybe put in the comments some ones that you can think of. Wilberforce. I love Wilberforce. Not just Wilberforce, but a number of freed slaves at that time as well. A number of people all around the world. What was their civil disobedience? So I'll keep this really simple. There was a sugar boycott. So in the UK, at least, people stopped eating sugar. Why? Because sugar came from the plantations that were being worked by the slaves. And if you stopped buying sugar, it hurt the slave owners in the pocket. It also made it financially less viable for them to keep trading slaves. So there was civil disobedience. That was only just one thing, the sugar boycott. There was a political campaign and numerous petitions. If you've seen that amazing film, Amazing Grace, you'll know there were petitions, you'll know there were campaigns. They made arguments, and then in terms of consensus building, They pressured MPs, and they had to build a consensus in the UK. There was a little bit of confusion there because it began to look like an anti-royalist, anti-monarchist, almost like a civil war uprising at one point, and it worried some of the landowners who were also often slave owners. So there was a bit of confusion there, but after a while they made the point that actually no, this is, and he gets the culture. This is an ethical issue. This is a moral issue. This isn't, oh, some people are for slaves, some people are not for slaves. The general populace and globally, the richer nations started to realise this is wrong. This is just plain wrong to treat a human being like property. And the law change, again, if you've seen the film or if you've read books about Wilberforce and others at the time, didn't change things. They just found other ways around it, and often the laws didn't quite go far enough. It was only when it became cultural, it was only when it became something which took time to unpick all of the machinery and the apparatus of slave trading, that it became a cultural moral norm. And today most of us would think that slavery is abhorrent, whether it be modern slavery, whether it be this transatlantic a more ancient slave trade. Pretty much all of us agree it's a moral issue. The aircon has finally gone off. That this is wrong. So you had your you had your civil disobedience, you had your campaign, you had consensus building with petitions, and then you had finally this cultural acceptance. Martin Luther King Jr. You can't really talk about campaigns without talking about him and Rosa Parks and others like them. Civil disobedience on buses or on marches, campaigning, sermons, speeches. We've all heard I Have a Dream. Books, pamphlets. There was a long and hard fought battle, and for the hearts and minds, not just of the decision makers and people in power, but for the consensus and the view of the American people. There was still a lot of steeped racism from the history of America, from the makeup of the Civil War and everything. That they had to undo all of that North-South divide, all of that thinking around black people being inferior, or all of that stuff. They had to build a civil disobedience, then campaign, then they had to build a consensus that it wasn't a threat, that the right to vote, the right to not be segregated wasn't going to be a threat to the American way of life. And then slowly the culture of racism has taken longer to change. Now we've seen protests with Black Lives Matters. We've seen very upsetting, worrying scenes. I'm sure you've seen videos. I'm sure you've read articles. The culture of racism is taking longer to change, despite the fact that all the laws, pretty much in most states, have changed. So, you could fairly say that the campaign for black, white, brown people to all be treated equally, with equal rights and equal standing and equal civil rights and freedoms has succeeded, and yet that cultural thing is still happening, and in certain institutions, in certain communities, in certain parts of America and UK and globally, it's taking longer to change. But the battle's sort of been won. It was just waiting for everything else to fall into place, you could argue. Gandhi, a couple more examples. Gandhi, so he defied the salt tax. We've had sugar. Yeah, there was a salt tax, and he marched 240 miles, leading to the arrest of 60,000 people. He mobilized 200 million people with civil disobedience. Now, when 200 million people in the British Empire start saying, we're not going to do what you tell us to do anymore, that gets noticed. And I love this quote: first they ignore you, like, we're more powerful, we're cleverer, we're the imperial leaders, we just ignore it. Oh, okay, now hang on, too many people are doing it now, this is not working. So first they ignore you, next they laugh at you, then they fight you, they get aggressive, they attack back, and then you win. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Mahatma Gandhi. Love that quote. Anyway, so he defied the salt tax. He campaigned on radio and on television. He became effectively a personality. He got a change in the consensus, in the corridors of power, and the populace enabled a new constitution declaring independence for his nation. And now the cultural bit, colonialism, the idea of an empire going in and saying, the famous "we've got a flag," Eddie Izzard, "we've got a flag, this is ours now." That whole "we've got a flag and we've got guns and we're here to civilize you" is now culturally unacceptable. It's a moral issue. So the culture has changed around colonialism. And then finally, Greta Thunberg, civil disobedience, a school strike for climate in 2019 in 125 countries, children, young people saying, hang on a minute, we're the ones who are going to be inheriting this earth after you. It's our kids, our grandkids, and you guys aren't moving fast enough. So we're going to skip school and we're going to get noticed, and you're going to notice that we're not happy. Civil disobedience, disrupting a campaign on TV and social media. Whatever you think about Greta, she is a very powerful communicator. She's on TV, she's on social media, and along with others. There were protests, so there was consensus building in the political state. We saw ahead of elections, for example, that people were mobilised. People were speaking at summits where world leaders were present. There was that one moment, wasn't there, where Trump, I think, left the room because Greta was getting up or something. There's consensus building within political powers, and as I've said before, it's academic studies that made that galvanised that lent support to not just a young girl, but when you get universities and great, towers of learning saying, no, hang on, she's got a point here. That starts to galvanise people. And then now it's a cultural norm. As I said before, I think most people support that we need to address climate crisis, that it's affecting not just the poor, which is bad enough, by the way, and would be a reason, but it's going to affect us all one day. So if you want to change the world, and maybe, the equivalent of COP26 in a few years' time, and you can be at the heart of that, four stages, 4 phases: civil disobedience, campaigning creatively, consensus building, and then finally cultural adoption. It becomes a moral issue that everyone can get behind, but must get behind. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoyed this slightly different format. You may or may not have enjoyed seeing my face, for those who are seeing it on YouTube and other places. And as I say, season 2 coming soon. Please do like and subscribe and comment. I'd love to know if you agree, disagree. I'd like to hear from more of you that agree than disagree, but do say what you feel. And maybe you can think of better examples than Wilberforce, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, and Greta. And I'll go and look them up and find out a bit more. Thanks so much.